Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, I want you to imagine a group of doctors, but their patient wasn't a person, it was a dying economy. We're talking about 18th century France, where this radical group of thinkers saw the economy not as some machine to be controlled, but as a living, breathing thing. They were called the Physiocrats, and trust me, their ideas would change the world.
So let's dive in with a puzzle that was absolutely confounding France in the mid-1700s. How on earth could a nation, blessed with some of the most fertile land in all of Europe, be constantly crippled by famines? I mean, it just didn't make sense. It was this huge paradox. But the Physiocrats, they were pretty sure they had the answer.
All right, Section 1, A Kingdom in Crisis. To really get what the Physiocrats' radical cure was all about, we first have to diagnose the disease. And France at the time was just a kingdom of contradictions. On the surface, it's a global superpower, right? But underneath, it's a nation where most people are just stuck in this endless cycle of poverty. I mean, France was just tangled up in this web of rules that honestly seemed designed to stop any kind of growth. You had government regulations that would specify the exact number of threads in a piece of cloth. You had internal tariffs, which meant that grain could literally be rotting in one province while people were starving just a few miles away. And then there was the hated corvée, which forced peasants to just drop everything and go do unpaid labor on public roads. And if you want a perfect example of just how absurd this all was, get this. A lawsuit between two guilds, the people who sold used clothes and the tailors, went on for 300 years. It outlived generations. That's how paralyzed the system was. These powerful guilds controlled every little thing, and they would spend fortunes just to crush any hint of competition. It was nuts. So Section 2, the rule of nature. Into all of this chaos steps this new group of thinkers, and they have a totally new diagnosis for what's wrong with France. They argued the problem wasn't the people. It was that all these man-made rules were actively fighting against nature itself. So they called themselves the Physiocrats. If you break down the Greek, it literally means rule of nature. And they were super inspired by the scientific discoveries of their time, like Newton's laws of physics. They thought, hey, what if the economy has its own natural order, its own set of laws? The government's job then wasn't to invent new rules, but to figure out what those natural laws were and just get out of the way. Now, when the leader of the group, François Quesnay, said he'd do nothing if he were king, he wasn't calling for anarchy. Not at all. It was about this profound shift in trust, a shift away from the clumsy, micromanaging state and towards a system where natural principles would just work, creating a much more prosperous society on their own.
All right, Section 3, a radical economic blueprint. So if the diagnosis was a sickness caused by all these artificial rules, what was the prescription? Well, in a word, freedom. Let's take a look at the Physiocrats' pretty radical plan for a whole new economy.
You've probably heard this one before, laissez-faire, laissez-passer. It literally means let do, let pass, and this became their battle cry. Let people make their own choices. Let goods move freely without all these crazy taxes and restrictions. It was a simple, powerful demand to just unleash the economy's natural potential. And this right here, this was a complete 180 from how everybody thought about economics back then. For centuries, the mercantilists saw wealth as this fixed pie of gold that the government had to hoard. The Physiocrats came along and said, no, you've got it all wrong. Wealth isn't captured, it's created. And for them, all true new wealth came from one place, the land. This way of thinking led them to divide society into three main buckets. First, you had the productive class, the farmers. They were the heroes who actually created new value, a surplus, from nature. Then you had the proprietary class, the landowners, who basically collected that surplus as rent. And finally, there was the so-called sterile class. That's everyone else. Now, sterile sounds like a pretty harsh word, right? But it wasn't an insult. It was a technical term. They just believed that artisans and merchants were just transforming value that already existed, not creating anything truly new from the earth. And based on this whole logic, they came up with an idea that was, well, it was breathtakingly simple, but also politically explosive. A solution to France's total nightmare of a tax system. The logic was super straightforward. They said, look, if all the new wealth, the net product, comes from the land, and it all ends up in the pockets of the landowners as rent, Why are we messing around with all these other complicated, corrupt taxes? Why not just cut out all the middlemen and go straight to the source? Tax the landowners. One tax. That's it. Okay, Section 4, the economy's circular flow. But how did all this wealth actually move around? How did it get from the farmers to the landowners to everyone else? Well, the leader of the group, that Dr. Francois Quesnay, had this amazing, groundbreaking insight that would change economics forever. So remember, Quesnay was a physician. He used what he knew, and he had this vision of the economy as being just like a living body. He saw wealth circulating through society just like blood circulates through our veins. And to map it all out, he created the world's first ever macroeconomic model. It was called the Tableau économique. And this model, it was a complete game changer. For the very first time, it showed how money flows through the economy in this self-sustaining loop. Landlords spend their rent, which becomes income for farmers and artisans. Then they use that income to buy stuff from each other and to pay rent, and the whole cycle just starts all over again. Honestly, this diagram is basically the great-great-grandfather of the circular flowcharts you see in every Econ 101 textbook today. It was the first time anyone tried to map the whole economy as one big interconnected system. All right, Section 5. So these theories sound pretty good on paper, right? But what happens when these elegant ideas crash into the brutal, messy reality of politics? For that, we've got to look at the dramatic and ultimately kind of tragic story of a guy named Anne Robert Jacques Turgot. Well, for one brief, shining moment in 1774, the Physiocrats got their shot. Turgot, a big believer in their ideas, gets appointed as France's finance minister, and he immediately launches this super ambitious program to put all those physiocratic reforms into practice and fix France's broken economy. And he didn't waste any time. He abolished the corvée, he freed the grain trade, he went after the monopolies of the guilds. But as you can see here, for every reform he made, he created a powerful enemy. The nobility, the crooked tax farmers, the guild masters, the elites at court. You're talking about the entire establishment that had gotten rich off the old corrupt system. And they suddenly saw it all slipping away. So what happened? That powerful coalition of losers, they ganged up on him. After just 20 months in office, that's it, not even 2 years, they forced the king to fire him. And his reforms? They were immediately reversed. It was a pretty harsh lesson that the old guard was just too powerful to allow for peaceful change. So, Section 6, why the Physiocrats matter. You might be thinking, well, that sounds like a total failure. And yeah, politically, it was. Their time in the spotlight was incredibly brief. But their ideas? Oh, their ideas completely changed how we think about economics. Forever. I mean, just look at this list. Their legacy is immense. Before them, nobody was really analyzing the economy as a whole interconnected system. They gave us that first macroeconomic model, the circular flow. They pioneered concepts like tax incidence, figuring out who really pays a tax, and of course, their championship of laissez-faire would go on to have a massive influence on Adam Smith and the entire foundation of classical economics. So the Physiocrats believed that real prosperity doesn't come from clever government plans, it comes from aligning our human laws with nature's economic laws. And that central question, that debate about the right balance between free markets, regulation, and the role of government, is the very same debate we are still having in our economies, all over the world, to this very day.